Right, back tonight here on In Focus. The International Court of Justice will tomorrow reveal whether South Africa's provisional measures are granted in its genocidal intent case against Israel. Tel Aviv's military offensive on Gaza followed a surprise attack on the 7th of October by Hamas fighters, which killed 1,200 people and saw over 200 Israelis taken hostage. To date, nearly 26,000 people have reported to have been killed in the Palestinian enclave. For more on this highly anticipated judgment, we are now joined by Ottilia Maunganidze, head of special projects at the Institute for Security Studies. Ottilia, thank you very much for coming on and for your intervention tonight. So it was announced already that the ICJ will be, of course, making this announcement tomorrow. It's not a guilty or not guilty type of judgment, but is a judgment to say you've made a number of requests in terms of provisions or measures that you would want to see in place. Is it possible that they'll reject all those measures?
It's unlikely that the ICJ would reject all of the provisional measures that South Africa has requested. During the arguments that were made earlier this month, Israel really did focus on three main provisional measures that meant, for example, the stopping of the war in its entirety, the fact that there were obligations or South Africa sought obligations only on South Africa and Israel in respect of prevention of genocide, and then also to the extent to which Israel argued that while there is a war ongoing, that they did not see it reaching the extent of genocide. But of course, South Africa has requested an order on 9 provisional measures, so it is likely that the ICJ would grant a number of those measures, and those that it not grant, it would maybe amend, so limit the extent of the provisional measure, but still it's most likely that there would be provisional measures ordered.
First prize for South Africa is a ceasefire. I mean, we've heard Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu saying the war will continue until they've actually won. How does that happen in that particular context if the court indeed does grant South Africa an emergency provisional measure of a ceasefire?
In the instance, and like you say, for example, Israel, through the Prime Minister, has already indicated that they don't have an intention for a lengthy ceasefire or even an end to the conflict, having rejected the offer that was brokered by Qatar just earlier this week. So the next step, if the ICJ were to order the main provisional measure that South Africa is seeking, is for the UN Security Council to then act on that order. Now, here's where it gets a little bit tricky because, of course, at the UN Security Council, one of the permanent members, the United States, has to date been vetoing any decision that would result in a complete or total ceasefire. But over the past 2 weeks, since both Israel and South Africa made their arguments, it was very clear that the U.S. is trying to push Israel towards a ceasefire. So perhaps we could be surprised, and the UN Security Council could go, if the ICJ orders that, it could go the way of the ICJ ruling. For many South Africans, maybe you might know, but for many South Africans, we don't know. We've never been in this court. We don't know how it works, whether or not South Africa did enough to show that the claims are valid under the Genocide Convention. So, taking a step back, this is the start of a process. The full arguments as to the extent of the genocide will only be argued once now the ICJ, in addition to the provisional measures, would also establish whether or not it has jurisdiction to hear the case in full and whether South Africa has standing. Those first two, so the jurisdiction and the standing, in my mind are quite clear. Both Israel and South Africa are member states to the Genocide Convention, and of course all member states have an obligation to prevent genocide. the arguments that the South African Council made on the 11th of January, in my mind, were quite convincing, not only in providing the proper and full context in which the conflict is happening, but also referencing direct quotes from members of the Israeli government, including those in the war cabinet. Now, what I think is perhaps a little bit more important beyond the arguments that South Africa made is that since that hearing just 2 weeks ago, we've already seen statements coming from Israeli authorities, including the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, alluding to the fact that, one, that they would reject possibly a decision coming out of the International Court of Justice, but then also reiterating some of the issues that South Africa itself raised. We have seen bombardments on convoys meant to be supplying humanitarian aid. We've seen attacks on people that are moving towards areas of safety. So in many ways, while South Africa's arguments were strong, they were, I would say, over the past 2 weeks, vindicated by the actions of the Israeli authorities themselves.
Yeah. Even so, there are others who are saying the court is unlikely to order the suspension of military activities. It might even be a hollow victory, one that simply says, well, just ensure that your military operations are conducted in accordance with international law and you don't harm innocent civilians, which is what Israel has been saying we are doing anyway. Well, we know that the opposite, of course, is happening.
Right. So, like you said earlier, that is the main provisional measure that South Africa is seeking. It wouldn't be the first time that the ICJ has been asked by a member state to push for such a ceasefire. We saw it in 1993 when Bosnia and Herzegovina asked the same in respect of Serbia and Montenegro. We saw it when the Gambia sought the same for Myanmar, and again when Ukraine sought it for Russia. Now, perhaps the slight difference here is we are now over 3 months into the conflict in Gaza, and what we are seeing, unfortunately, is an escalation. It could be, like you say, that the ICJ orders a partial or makes a statement around the need to protect civilians, to prevent genocide, and to ensure that the war has a limited impact on Palestinians, which, in my mind, is not a hollow victory because, of course, part of the arguments that Israel has made is that this is a necessary war and that essentially most, if not all, civilians are in some way affiliated with Hamas. Now, if the ICJ were to make an order that says, no, in fact, the majority of the people in Palestine are not military targets, that they are civilians, then that would be quite a win, because that is at the heart of South Africa's argument, that you cannot attack an entire population based on the actions or the sins of a few among them.
So it's the United Nations World Court. However, this decision then will need to go to the Security Council, if I'm correct, where, again, it will still need to be voted on.
Yes, and this is specific, of course, to the issues related to the ceasefire. There are other provisional measures that South Africa is seeking, like, for example, the preservation of evidence, the need to investigate, but also importantly, the limiting, if I can put it that way, of any other acts beyond just the extent to which it is genocide. So yes, the UN Security Council would have to convene fairly quickly should the ICJ order, the main, if I can call them that way, provisional measures that South Africa is seeking. But as I said, because the US over the past 2 weeks has been trying the best that they can to engage with Israel on limiting civilian casualties, on limiting the impact of the conflict, because of course if later on there is a decision against Israel, It would also impact those parties, those states that have lent support to Israel, including through military means, weapons, as well as technical support, which of course the United States has been doing with Israel in this particular conflict since October.
Now, you've already mentioned, provisional measures have recently been provided, for example, in cases involving Russia, an invasion of Ukraine. As we speak, there is still bombardments and missiles are going on there, almost as if it was completely ignored. If anything, what would South Africa have achieved through this action?
So, two things. The first is really calling the world's attention, let me rephrase, to what is currently ongoing in Palestine and the extent to which it could be genocide. That in and of itself is an important step on the part of South Africa, and South African Council, like I said, argued that extremely well. The second is the extent to which international institutions can really act. A lot has been said around South Africa pushing for this process also to test the ability of the international justice system to actually ensure justice. Now, that, for example, in the Ukraine and Russia matter, the conflict continues, does not mean that now or even at a later stage that there won't be accountability. It creates an historical record that at the least a court, and in this case the highest court for the UN, has made a declaration on the war, and in particular on whether the Genocide Convention has been violated. So those would be two significant wins for South Africa in this instance, highlighting the plight of Palestinian people and the need for any member state of the Genocide Convention to be able to invoke it. It's exactly what the Gambia did a little over 3 years ago in respect of what is ongoing in Myanmar.
Ottilia, appreciate your time. Thank you very much for coming on. Ottilia Anna Maunganidze, the head of special projects at the Institute for Security Studies.